Hail and well met. This is not the video you were looking for, but thank you for clicking on it anyway. Today, somebody asked me, can you play D&D in Star Wars? Now, this is not a bad question at all. However, it is one that can be answered emphatically with a yes. There are many Star Wars RPGs, a few of them that are still being supported right now by Fantasy Flight Games. There's 3 of them even. They have their own fancy dice. Whenever you call upon the light side of the Force to help you out, the Dungeon Master, or whatever they call it, they can then use the dark side of the Force to roll against you in a future scenario to keep the Force in balance. That's a nice little trick. There is also a pretty impressive, at least if I am judging the books by their covers, pretty impressive operation where somebody has gone through and made some fan releases of Star Wars 5th edition. So even if you want to keep it within 5th edition D&D, we have options. And if you don't want to go off by that, I mean, Spelljammer exists. And yes, Spelljammer is its own thing, which, by the way, has been around since AD&D. So if you're worried about the Wizards of the Coast pushing sci-fi into my fantasy, like, they've been doing that for forever, and it's, I think, made the game better than what it could have been if we just stuck strictly to, castles and chainmail kind of stuff. Oh, one more thing. I would absolutely recommend checking out Scum and Villainy for a totally not Star Wars experience. Oh, wait a minute, one more thing. Knights of the Old Republic is totally built on a 3rd edition Dungeons & Dragons chassis, so if you want to see a good example of what that would look like, go check out those games. So, can you play D&D in Star Wars? Yes, absolutely. But let's say you don't like any of the options that I just mentioned. You're sitting at home with all your D&D pals who all want to play Star Wars D&D, and you just have your 5th edition player's handbook and whatnot. Can you adapt the Star Wars material into a fun time for that table, and how easy or hard will it be? Well, that's what we're going to look at today. So for those of you who haven't seen me do one of these before, hi, welcome to my channel. Thank you so much for clicking. What I am going to do to answer the question, can you play Dungeons & Dragons in Star Wars, is we're going to break down this fictional property for D&D based on 10 stats. We're going to look at concept, exploration, equipment, magic, backgrounds, lineages, classes, content, monsters, and flavor. Each one I will score up to 10 points at the end. If the thing we're looking at has at least 70 points, I'll say that that is viable for you to grab your books, grab your players, and go start playing D&D Star Wars right now. It's a little hard to pin down the concept of Star Wars. George Lucas's own influences came from Flash Gordon, samurai movies, and his own countercultural beatnik preferences. Asking what kind of adventure you can have in Star Wars is like asking what kind of adventure you can have in Forgotten Realms, except even more expansive. Even honing in on one piece of history like the Clone Wars provides plenty of potential material for a ragtag group of ruffians who met in a cantina, as has been proven through multiple TV shows just from that era. The concept for Star Wars in your 5e game works, and I'm giving it a 9 out of 10. The only reason it's not a 10 is because you will all be finding so many cool possibilities that it will be hard to pin down one campaign or even one sandbox. There are hundreds of established planets in Star Wars lore. And while the whole monobiome thing has been criticized, I actually think the simplicity of here's the desert planet, here's the rain planet, etc., really works for something like D&D. Then, once you get onto that planet, little seedy towns, warded and guarded fortresses, and crime lords' bases featuring traps and surprises all work exceedingly well for your average D&D game. The Death Star is very much its own dungeon, teeming with environmental hazards and monsters, and traveling to and from these locations is a big part of the adventure. This one is an easy 10 out of 10. Health potions? Nah, son. Back to tanks. The DMG provides us with a Sunblade and a few futuristic weapon entries. A lot of the equipment we see used can be reflavored as magic items, a la the Artificer class seen in the Eberron and Tasha's books, but just because that reflavoring possibility is there doesn't mean it's not going to be some work for you as the DM. It is going to take potentially a lot of work, and for some players, it still won't be sufficient enough to say, here is your Mandalorian jetpack. Once you attune, you may cast Levitate targeting yourself at will. Considering everything here, I'm still going to give equipment an 8 out of 10. I should note that your starship and land cruisers are equipment that might require stats and such. You could forgo this if you're used to your exploration being in a more montage sense, but I have a feeling you'll want at least one speeder bike chase. You can substitute a tauntaun for a warhorse, but perhaps not a carriage for an X-Wing. While I think this is a factor, I still don't foresee it being the reason people want to play Star Wars D&D, so I'm choosing not to dock it. Here's where things get tricky. Do you think magic is just tech that hasn't been understood yet? If so, most 5e spells can be described with special pieces of sci-fi fantasy tech. If your imagination and descriptive ability don't mesh like that, however, this is going to give you a hard time. I do believe Star Wars is a magical setting. We have the Force, after all, although its effects aren't always as exciting as higher-level D&D spells. The Force is hard to put mechanics on, and it is more of just a vibe, trusting your feeling, dude. This has been done well, but maybe not with spell slots like we see in 5e. Beyond that, ideas like light speed travel and galactic democracy seem more magical than what we see in more heavy sci-fi settings like Dune. Although in Dune we still have nobles and murder hobos fighting each other with swords and politicking in castles, so well, that's another video. Bottom line is this one is going to be a stretch to get right. If you've limited yourself to your books and homebrew knowledge rather than seeking what the guys at SW5E.com have figured out, I think you're in for a bumpy ride. I'm giving Magic a 6 out of 10. This one is easy. It's a 10 out of 10. Even in the first Star Wars movie, we have a hermit, a folk hero, a criminal, an outlander, and a noble take down an artifact of destruction wielded by a Dark Lord and his evil empire. In the prequel trilogy, we see how two Jedi monks, Obi-Wan and Anakin, have different approaches based on their backgrounds, one as a longtime acolyte or knight, and the other as a freed urchin slave. Backgrounds matter in Star Wars like they should matter in your game, and this is another 10 out of 10. Quick note here, lineages is just the word that I like to use for race ever since it looked like that's what we were going to use in Tasha's. Species may be our new official word for 1D&D, but it hasn't stuck yet. So look, just please use whatever word works best for you. Anyway, Star Wars has a ton of alien origins, even more than what we see provided in canon 5e printing. They can all be pretty analogous too. Wookiees are bugbears, Ewoks are goblins, Yoda looks like a goblin, but is probably more of a forest gnome. Darth Maul is a tiefling. Luke is a human. You get the idea. We even have droid representation with things like Warforged and Autognomes. Although, if you want to play droids, I bet you will still want more customization, like previous editions of Warforged, which means more sources and a little more work. It's not perfect, but it's close enough. 9 out of 10. Just like with the futuristic equipment, you can have your sorcerer and wizard describe how when they are casting their fireball, they are actually firing a rocket, or your ranger's entangling strike is actually a special net setting on their bolt caster. That's usually how an artificer works, but for this case, I think we can expand that descriptive power of the artificer into other classes. Otherwise, everyone is just an artificer. Jedi and Sith are tricky. I think Monk is the easiest way to go, but I could easily see you bringing in all sorts of Paladins, Hexblade Warlock, Eldritch Knight Fighter, or the Sith Lightning Specialist Tempest Cleric to the mix. The list could go on, and ultimately, if you brought any of these to my table and said, "This is my Jedi," I would say dope and move on to the fun. My recommendation here is not to pigeonhole classes like Smuggler or Jedi or Bounty Hunter. Just use these as your character concept and don't let class define you. I know others will disagree with me, and there is some imagination stretching and rules lawyering to be done here, so I'm going to say 7 here. Content is usually something I have a lot to say about and give a divisive answer for, but Star Wars is a series of PG and PG-13 movies, so I don't think we're breaking anyone's safe space by sticking around the source material. There's a ton of violence, but it's never gratuitous or dwelled upon. You get your hand chopped off and you move on with your day, just like in your D&D game. That's not to say there aren't some risks. If you hate fascist imagery, then it might be hard to avoid the Empire or First Order in some form, although your character can just be like most Star Wars protagonists and dismantle the fascist regime with direct action. And please, for the love of Carrie Fisher, DMs, do not force your only female player character to wear a slave costume or try to explain that there are no bras in space. At the end of the day, I think Star Wars is a great role model for a more PG game that still has adult implications. If there's a Star Wars monster you like, you can probably find it in a monster manual. And if there's a monster you like, you can make an excuse for seeing it in the Star Wars universe. A lot of our BBGGs are humanoid bounty hunters and force users with special equipment and abilities, which makes for good fights too. Again, there's a lot of reflavoring work to be done, but I think it's easier here than with magic and classes, so we're going to get a 9 out of 10. There's a reason why Star Wars has endured almost 50 years, where other space operas have come and gone. Star Wars is the biggest IP I'll cover, and you can't get there without distinct and iconic flavor. This is likely going to be an easier sell to your friends who have never played D&D before. They may not know Drizzt Do'Urden, but they probably know Han Solo. It's a 10 out of 10. So when we tally up our final stats, we get a strong score of 88. If you're serious about taking on a Star Wars D&D campaign, I would encourage you to check out Scum Villainy or the free SW5E supplements. But if you just want a quick one-shot, there are a few IPs better suited for D&D than Star Wars. Are you still complaining about the sequel trilogy? That's valid. There's lots of reasons too. Remember, it is possible to get your friends together, engage in a little collaborative fan fiction, and make your own episodes 7, 8, and 9 at your kitchen table by rolling some dice and telling your own story free from the shackles of evil corporations. I hope you enjoyed this video. If you were hoping more for a breakdown of how to play D&D in the individual movies and shows of Star Wars, well, I have a companion piece for that. Go check it out if you so wish. Thank you guys so much for watching this. May the Force be with you. Have a Nat 20 day. Bye-bye.